On June 23rd, 2014, the Reverend Charles Moore of the United Methodist Church drove to a strip mall in Grand Saline, Texas. There, outside of a dollar store, a pharmacy, and a beauty salon, Reverend Moore doused himself in gasoline in the parking lot and lit himself on fire. He did so to protest racial injustice against queer people, and acceptance of the death penalty in his home state of Texas and his home church. He did so at the end of a long life of political action. He did so because after 79 years of life, he could no longer reconcile the ideals of his heart with the cruelty of the world he lived in. And so Reverend Charles R. Moore burned himself to death as a way of showing the world around him how ugly it really is. The violence of this act served as a demonstration of the violence occurring around us every day, which is easier to overlook. And of course, the commentary was endless. Some called him crazy, which is possible. Some called him depressed and unbalanced, which also may have been true. I never knew the man, and I cannot testify to these. But one person in particular, the Reverend Jeff Hood, wrote, "If we do call Moore insane, we must also turn our heads from Jesus and call him insane too. For we must not forget, Jesus sat in the Garden of Gethsemane and made a conscious, clear decision to step out into death, just like Moore." It's a valid point, and it's not Gethsemane alone. In today's text, too, we see Jesus warned that Herod is coming to kill him, but he refuses to relent, and in fact aims to go directly to Jerusalem, the city that murders the prophets. And Jesus does this a lot. He tells his disciples he's going to die. He tells the crowds. He once foretold his own death to the very people who would commit the act. And when the traitor in his party approached him to do the deed, Jesus, knowing full well what it meant, greeted him with a kiss. Plenty of people like to talk about the fanaticism of those who go willingly to death for a cause, but they conveniently forget that a large percentage of us worship just such a person. And I've long been obsessed with martyrdom and what it means, so I can tell you about a lot of similar cases. Norman Morrison, a Quaker and father of 3 who lit himself on fire to protest the Vietnam War. Or if burning is not your thing, Simone Weil, a French mystic who spent years writing on human suffering to the end that, according to some, her death and frailty were rooted in self-starvation as witness to worldly suffering. Or if you pay attention to world news, you may have heard about Palestinian journalist Mohammed al-Qiq, currently on his 88th day of a hunger strike during his own imprisonment without charge. Each of them faced the near certainty of death because they could no longer abide in silence the suffering of the world. Moreover, I will point you to Perpetua, one of the best recorded early martyrs of the church. I will point you specifically to the fact that while in prison, before being slaughtered in the Roman games for professing Christianity, her father came to beg her to give up her foolishness, to come home to her newborn child, and recant her confession of faith. And she said to him, "I cannot be called anything other than what I am, a Christian." And for this she was killed. For me, there is a marked thread running between our gospel text today, in which Jesus refuses to give up his ministry, though it will mean his death, and our epistle, in which Paul encourages the Philippians to live as citizens of heaven, rather than those who conform to this world and serve only the God in their stomach, the deity of their own desire. I have been thinking lately about the world, about how hard it is to live in it while clinging to the values of heaven, of goodness, of the divine realm and kingdom to which I and we all feel called. About how much of a struggle it is to defend the sense of love, charity, and goodwill. About the trial of seeking to serve others when we are constantly urged to think of our own need and want, and this is made more difficult by those who target us in their greed and hostility. about how at risk we are when we, like Perpetua, refuse to be anything other than Christians, acting with an allegiance to God. 4 nights a week, I corral anywhere from 40 to 70 men into one of 2 tiny rooms, and I welcome them to sleep on the floor, because there's nowhere else for them to go, and we have no more space than that to give them. And they are mean and angry, and they fight for their little space in a tightly packed room, and they lash out at each other, and they lash out at me, and they do this because they've been forced to the edge of their existence by the powers that be. And their own survival depends on how fiercely they can defend the little space they have. And 4 nights a week, I wish they could learn how to be good to each other. But I know that to do so will often mean being taken advantage of to the peril of their own survival. Friends, I tell you now, you have no idea how hard this world makes it for some of us to be good, to show love, and to be kind. So it stands out all the clearer to me when I see those who, in the face of suffering and mortality, refuse to relent, who risk or give their own lives rather than be conformed to the beast the world can sometimes make of us, and whose citizenship in heaven is dearer to them than their lives. So I read these verses tonight, and I think of Charles Moore and Simone Weil and Norrin Morrison, who would all rather die than be conformed to violence and selfishness and all kinds of nastiness, or just to passivity. And I am sad because they are no longer here to fight with us for goodness, because their passionate, sacrificial hearts have burned out and wasted away. While I admire these figures, I also think there is something very distinct separating their deaths from the martyrdom of Christ or of Perpetua. But before I get into that, let me tell you about my depression. You see, I read an essay last summer by a theologian named Nadia Bolz-Weber called Demon Possession and Why I Named My Depression Francis. And shortly thereafter, I decided to give it a try. So I first gave a name to my anxiety, Richard, and I found that suddenly he had a character and a persona. Rather than being a vague shadow, he became a pompous blowhard in horn-rimmed glasses and a sweater vest who loves to criticize anyone and anything. And it became that much easier not to listen to him. Sure, he is a part of me, but I can spot him. I know what he likes and what he says, and I know his personality. More importantly, I know my anxious thoughts are just that. They are not revelations. They are not truths of the world. They are a small, critical voice in my head whom I can choose to ignore. And so it is too with my depression, whose name is Gash. Gash is a frail little Alston punk kid. He wears all black and skinny jeans, and he loves to lie in bed all day, getting drunk and not caring about things. And the big thing about him is that Gash thinks suffering and pain are all so freaking poetic. He thinks it's beautiful to meditate on the cruelty of the world and how nobody cares and nobody wins and it's all meaningless. And Gash wants nothing more than to bring me down with him. So every now and then he calls to me when I'm weak and frustrated, and he tells me to give up. He tells me that it doesn't actually pay to be good to people, and it doesn't change things. He tells me that no matter what I do, I can't win, and we can't win, and the world is going to keep spinning and being a mess, and then we all die. So there's really no point to anything. And that's the point, and there's the difference. Simone Weil and Charles Moore cared, and they cared deeply, and they cared so much that it was worth more to them than their lives. And so did Jesus. But when they reached the point of passion about their cause that surpassed the biological impulse to survive, they chose to die. And Jesus chose to do something about it, to do many things. Jesus chose to resist. He was told that they were on their way to kill him, and he said, "Let them threaten me, let them kill me, but in the meantime, I have work to do." In contemporary theology, it is fashionable to disown the cross, to say that Jesus' suffering and death weren't the important part of his ministry, but his healing and his teaching and his life. And often people do this for the very fear of glorifying death that may lead to more self-imposed martyrs. But for me, these streams of thought miss the point that Jesus' suffering and death came as a direct result of his ministry. He did work that the empire and the world would not allow. He healed and made the outcast to be included. He taught against the unjust structure of his society. He lived in a way that threatened the empire. And so his work made his death inevitable, and he knew this. This is why we need texts like today's gospel reading that remind us Jesus knew his death was coming. He knew it because he recognized it as the cost of his work in the world, and he accepted it, but did not surrender to death. He committed himself to work that risked execution, and it came to pass, but before it did, he made a lot of difference. And he inspired a movement that made even more of a difference, many of whom also died when their important work and their acts of the citizenship of heaven also threatened the empire. And I think of them when I read this text. Yes, I also think of Charles Moore and Simone Weil, and I think of all the things they could have done in the world once the powers of empire lost the threat of execution. And I become sad for the fact that they chose suicide over action. But I then think of all those who lived in such a way to make existing power structures want to kill them. I think of the nasty, selfish, unjust cultures we live in, and I think of those whose very existence threatened these structures, and I am glad for them. I am glad for Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X for dedicating themselves to the cause of racial justice, though it eventually meant their assassinations. And I am glad for Marsha P. Johnson and for Harvey Milk and for all the unnamed queer souls who were put down because the search for their rights to love and self-expression threatened the gendered power structure. And I am glad for Oscar Romero, whose zeal for the rights of his fellow people to live free of injustice and the threat of torture and murder led him to stay the path of resistance until he was killed mid-mass. And I am thankful for all of those unnamed union workers and members who risked police brutality and starvation and threats in their strikes and their fights to ensure a working wage and livable conditions for the labor class. And I'm glad for Jesus, whose commitment to human compassion led him along the path that would end in Jerusalem with the murder of another prophet. I am unendingly glad for all those saints who did not seek death, but who recognize that some causes are important enough to die for. And I am glad for all those who felt the flames of passion for justice in their hearts and let those flames drive them onward to commit acts that would eventually bring down structures of oppression, and who did this though it might have meant their death. And in this Lenten time, when we reflect on the dark places in the world, I am glad for those who refuse to snuff their light out, and who shone in the darkness to the rest of us, despite the threat upon them. Amen.